She was just property, until one man showed her what home feels like. They found her curled up beneath an abandoned train car, ribs showing, eyes dull, body trembling at every sound. No one knew her name. No one cared. Just another discarded canine asset dumped when her body broke before the mission ended. But someone did stop. Elias, a man with eyes just as tired as hers. A man who had buried too many people and too many memories. When he extended his hand, she didn't bite, but she didn't move either. That's where it began. This isn't just a story about rescuing a dog. It's about healing that runs both ways, and how sometimes the most broken among us carry the softest light. Stay with us until the end, because the way this dog, this soul rises from fear into forgiveness, will leave you breathless. The crunch of Elias Marlowe's boots on the loose gravel was the only sound interrupting the silence. A golden wash of sunlight spilled through the trees, stretching long shadows across the narrow trail winding through Galicia's forgotten forest. The pines stood like silent witnesses, tall and unmoving, their needles whispering softly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance a jay cried out, once sharp, sudden, then all was still again. He hadn't spoken a word in hours. Hadn't needed to. Silence, he had come to realize, was more than the absence of noise. It was a presence of its own, thick, aware, at times suffocating. And in this silence, Elias walked, not so much with direction as with intention, to lose himself in the trees, the air, the ache, to forget, if only for a day, that he was the one still alive. 3 days earlier, he'd arrived at a modest guest house on the outskirts of the village of Bruma. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, not even his parents. The funeral had drained him. The endless condolences, the way people tilted their heads with that rehearsed sympathy, like he was supposed to say something profound. But what was there to say when your younger sister, your only sibling, was gone before you? Elias had been photographing war zones just 6 months earlier. He had stood in rubble, shot frames between air raid sirens, but nothing had prepared him for finding Layla collapsed on her bathroom floor. No warning, no goodbye. Just a call from the building manager about a smell coming from apartment 2B, survivor's guilt, they called it. But to Elias, it felt more like a curse, a weight stitched into every heartbeat. And now, here he was, walking deep into the wild, hoping the forest might soften what therapy could not. His camera bag hung at his side, though he hadn't taken a single photo today. Somehow raising a lens between himself and the world felt dishonest, like he was observing, not feeling. And right now, Elias needed to feel everything: the cool of the air, the ache in his legs, the sting in his chest. The trail narrowed slightly, its edges marked by roots and stones. Dust rose faintly as he stepped, catching the fading sunlight in soft spirals. He paused at a fork-right path toward the ravine overlook, left toward the forgotten orchard the innkeeper had mentioned. Neither mattered. The map was irrelevant. He wasn't searching for a destination, just release. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed. A single pine cone fell near his foot with a quiet thud. The scent of moss, old bark, and sun-warmed soil filled his lungs. This place was ancient, untouched. It had existed long before him, and would go on long after. He kept walking, slower now. A fallen branch cracked beneath his boot, startling a squirrel that darted up a tree. He watched it vanish into the canopy, then let his eyes drift across the undergrowth. Ferns tangled at the base of trunks, Dappled light shimmered across damp leaves. Everything felt suspended, like the forest was holding its breath. Elias didn't realize it at first. A prickle along his spine, maybe? A shift in the air. Then he stopped. There, just ahead, the trail curved slightly, and something moved. He narrowed his eyes. The figure didn't run, didn't make a sound. It stood still, just out of reach of the sun's last rays. For a brief moment, Elias thought it might be a deer, or perhaps a wild dog. But when it stepped forward into the light, he saw it clearly. A German shepherd, thin as bone, coat matted and clumped with dirt. Its legs shook slightly, and one ear flopped while the other stood. There was no collar, no tag, just its eyes. Haunted, hollow, and yet aware. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. It simply looked at him. Not like an animal sizing up a stranger, but like a being who had known loss, who recognized something broken inside Elias too. The world contracted. No birds, no breeze, no sound but the faint whisper of pine needles above them. Elias's hand instinctively went to his side, brushing the canvas of his camera bag, but he didn't raise it. Somehow it felt wrong, like photographing this moment would diminish it. The dog took a cautious step forward, and he didn't move. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice caught in his throat. He didn't even know why. Maybe it was the look in the dog's eyes, or the way it stood, not like it wanted food or affection, but like it carried a message, a warning, or a plea. They stayed like that for several long seconds, man and dog, grief and desperation hanging between them in the slanting light. Then the German shepherd took one more step and collapsed. Not entirely, just enough that its legs gave slightly. But it didn't take its eyes off him. Elias blinked. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And as the dog's chest rose and fell with strained effort, Elias took his first step forward. He didn't know it yet, but the trail ahead wouldn't lead him back to the village. It would lead him into something darker, something urgent, and something that once seen could never be unseen. She stood directly in the middle of the path, unmoving, her body framed by the last shafts of light breaking through the forest canopy. Elias froze. The dog wasn't just thin. She was emaciated, as if life had been slowly drained from her one forgotten day at a time. Her once regal coat was a tangled mess of filth, burrs, and dried mud. Flecks of sap clung to her legs. Her chest heaved with every breath, shallow and erratic, like each inhale came at a cost. But none of that was what stopped Elias in his tracks. It was her eyes, dark, liquid, and entirely human in their sorrow. There was no aggression, no fear, just something older, something cracked and raw, like she'd been holding on too long to something already gone. He stared at her. She stared back. 1,000 images passed through Elias's mind. Photos he'd taken of mothers clutching children, of fathers shielding bodies from gunfire, of mourners kissing caskets. But never, never had he seen a look quite like this one, and certainly not from a dog. It wasn't the look of an animal that was hungry or lost. It was the look of something asking for help, without even knowing the word. He took a careful step forward. "Hey!" The dog didn't flinch. Another step. Elias knelt slightly, lowering himself. "You okay, girl?" His voice cracked too loud, too unsure against the hush of the forest. Still no reaction. Just those eyes. That's when he noticed her front paw trembled where it touched the dirt. So subtly, it might have gone unseen had the sun not caught the fine tremors. Her rib cage jutted out, her hips sharp and angular beneath the patchy fur. How long had she been out here? How had she survived? The dog took a breath, eyes still locked with his, and then, so slowly it felt deliberate, she stepped forward. Elias didn't move. He could hear his heartbeat now, louder than the birds, louder than the wind. The air felt heavier with each second, as if something unseen pressed down on both of them. The dog took another step, and then, without a sound, she reached him. She lowered her head delicately, almost respectfully, and gently clamped her teeth around the hem of his pants. Elias stiffened, not out of fear, but shock. She wasn't biting. It wasn't even a grip. It was a touch like a child pulling on a sleeve, asking someone to come. "Hey, hey, what is it?" he whispered. The dog looked up. Those eyes full of dust and despair searched his face. Then she let go, stepped back, and looked behind her into the woods. Her ears flicked slightly, like she was listening for something. Then she looked back at him, and did it again, this time with more urgency, another gentle tug, then a backward glance, like a question. Elias slowly rose to his feet. "You want me to follow you?" No bark, no whine, just a stare. But that was all he needed. He glanced around. The trail behind him was long, safe, well-traveled. He could turn back now, report the sighting, do the logical thing, but every part of his body told him something else. Stay with her. She looked back once more and took a limping step forward. That was when Elias noticed the blood-dried, barely visible, smeared along one back leg, a scabbed-over gash near the joint. It was old, but hadn't healed right. She was walking on memory and muscle now, not strength. And still, she moved. She paused after a few steps, looked over her shoulder at him, and waited. Something about that gesture made his throat tighten. He wasn't sure if it was instinct, empathy, or simply the unspoken pull of two broken things finding each other in the woods. But he took a step. Then another, and another. The dog resumed her path. The further they moved into the trees, the more the light seemed to pull away, like the forest was dimming, preparing him for whatever he was about to see. Elias didn't ask himself why he trusted her. He just did. There was something in her silence, in her steady glances back, in the way she never ran, never barked, never forced him, just asked again and again with those eyes in the dust. The trees swallowed them in silence. Elias stepped off the main trail and into the brush without a word, letting the branches scratch at his jacket, his boots sinking slightly into moss and leaf rot. The air changed almost immediately. It grew stiller, denser, as though they'd crossed an invisible line where sound didn't dare follow. Ahead, the dog, this silent, skeletal shadow of a German shepherd, moved with a strange rhythm, limping, pausing, glancing back. Her tail was low, her posture tight, but not in fear. It was focus, grit. Something lived in her that refused to break, no matter how torn her body was. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder, not to check if Elias was still there, but to make sure, to reassure herself that he hadn't changed his mind. Elias didn't speak. He didn't want to startle the delicate thread that had been spun between them. He simply followed, breath steady, heartbeat louder than he liked to admit. They were deeper into the woods now, far from the familiar hum of the trail. Sunlight barely pierced through the overlapping canopies above, and what little light remained danced in strange patterns, flashes across tree bark, glints on wet leaves. The kind of light that played tricks, the kind of light that didn't feel safe. He wiped a hand across his brow. The temperature hadn't dropped, but the air had grown cold, like a memory pressing against his skin. He could taste it, something metallic, something still. Even the birds had gone quiet. He wasn't just following a dog. He was being led into something broken. She stumbled once, not hard, just enough to falter, and Elias's breath caught. But she didn't stop. She gave her paw one quick shake, then kept limping forward, weaving between trees, her nose occasionally sniffing the air, always pressing ahead like a thread pulling her toward the same invisible point. And still, those backward glances, that same look. Are you still with me? He wanted to say yes, to whisper it, but it felt too loud, too human. So he simply nodded, once, even though she couldn't see it. He had questions, 1,000 of them. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why him? But none of that mattered, because something in him already knew this wasn't random. Something had happened, something that had driven this animal to the brink, and yet somehow she had waited, held on, just long enough to find one last human to believe in. That kind of faith doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from love, or loss, or both. They pushed deeper. The undergrowth thickened. Dead branches tangled at their feet like bones beneath the soil. The smell shifted earthier, sour. A wetness lingered in the air now, almost like mildew. Not rain, not soil. Something old. Elias swallowed. His instincts stirred in a way he hadn't felt since his time in conflict zones. This wasn't just a hike anymore. This was a threshold. And whatever waited beyond it, he wasn't sure he wanted to see it. But turning back? That wasn't an option. Not now. The dog slowed again. She turned, not with panic, but with something else. Something fragile. Her ribs rose and fell sharply with each breath. Her legs trembled just slightly. Her eyes looked at him like they carried a secret too heavy for one creature to bear. And for the first time, Elias truly saw her. Not just the wounds or the filth, but the fight. She wasn't asking him for food, or warmth, or even safety. She was asking him to witness something no one else had dared to. She whimpered, just once. A sound so low, so cracked, it barely broke the space between them. But it was enough to make Elias's stomach twist. He stepped forward and crouched to her level. "Okay," he said softly. "Show me." She blinked. No tail wag, no panting tongue. But something in her gaze shifted. Then she turned, and for the first time ran. Not fast, not wildly, but with urgency, like time had just snapped forward and every second mattered again. She limped with purpose, weaving through the trees, now without hesitation. Elias broke into a jog behind her, dodging roots, ducking under branches. His bag thumped against his side. His boots slipped on wet soil. But he didn't stop, because now he felt it too. The pull, the plea that had no words. Something waited ahead, something she needed him to see. The path narrowed again, if it could be called a path at all, until it became little more than a tunnel of low-hanging branches and shadow. And just as he considered calling out to her, she stopped, dead still. Elias slowed, his breath catching in his throat. She stood before a structure barely visible at first. The forest had almost swallowed it. Vines choked its sides. The roof slanted as if the weight of time had pressed it down. A cabin, wooden, decaying, forgotten. She walked up to the door and pressed one paw against it. Then she looked back, one last time, and in that moment, Elias understood. This wasn't just a place. This was a burial ground for something sacred, and she was its guardian. The cabin looked like it had been forgotten by time, as if the forest had tried to erase it, but ran out of mercy halfway through. Its wooden frame slouched against the weight of years, boards warped and rotting like bones left too long in the sun. Ivy clung to the sides like a warning, coiling up over shattered windows and across the crooked roof. The paint, if it ever had any, was long swallowed by moss and mildew. Shadows bled from the gaps in the wood, thick and unmoving. Elias slowed to a stop, his chest rising and falling hard from the run. The dog, still unnamed, still silent, stood before the door. Her breathing was ragged. One front paw lifted, trembling. She raised it, pressed it against the rotted wood, and scratched. Not loudly, not forcefully, just enough. Enough to say, "We're here." Then she whimpered. A sound so small, so shattered, it split something in Elias's chest. It wasn't pain, it wasn't hunger, it wasn't fear, it was pleading. She looked at him. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching against the brittle carpet of fallen leaves and broken twigs. His hand reached out and hovered near the rusted doorknob, its metal streaked with decay and old stains. He didn't want to touch it. Everything in him said not to. That some doors, once opened, never truly close again. But then he looked down. The dog had backed away slightly, head low, ribs visible with every shaky breath. But her eyes hadn't left him, and in them was everything: desperation, resignation, and a fragile sliver of belief. She had brought him here because no one else came, because no one else answered. Elias swallowed the knot rising in his throat, then pushed. The door groaned like a wounded animal. Its hinges fought him, shrieking in protest, then gave way. The air that poured out was thick and wrong, humid, metallic, soaked with rot. It clung to his skin like a shroud. He gagged. Something inside had died recently, or long ago, he couldn't tell, but the smell was layered, as if grief had decayed on top of violence. He reached for the flashlight clipped to his bag and clicked it on. A narrow beam sliced into the darkness. Dust shimmered in the light like falling ash. The inside of the cabin was almost hollow. The floor sagged in places. Furniture sat broken, collapsed under mold and time. A table with one leg missing. An overturned chair. Splinters scattered like shrapnel. And then he heard it. A sound. So soft he thought he imagined it. But no, it came again. A low, wet, shifting from the far corner. The dog moved forward now, slowly, limping toward the sound with something like reverence. Elias followed, his beam tracing cracked floorboards, torn fabric, and then there, a table pushed against the wall, behind it a mound of filthy blankets, and nestled in the corner of that filth movement. He froze, then crouched, angling the flashlight lower. The beam caught the glint of eyes, small, wide, and glistening. 3 pairs, 3 puppies. They didn't bark, didn't move much. One twitched feebly. Another barely lifted its head. Their fur was patchy, clinging to 2 small bodies, ribs visible, noses dry, too weak to cry, too tired to care. Elias's breath hitched. The dog, the mother, he realized, sat beside them now. She nudged one gently with her nose. It didn't respond. She licked it once, a soft, broken motion, then looked up at him, and Elias felt his entire body go still. This was why. This was what she carried in her eyes. Not just pain, not just loss, but the unbearable weight of trying to keep something alive when everything else says let go. His flashlight shifted slightly, and in the other corner of the cabin, it caught metal. A cage, large, rusted. The door was bent outward, like something had clawed from the inside. Inside the cage, dark stains crusted the floor-dried blood. Next to the bars, a small bundle, still, not breathing. Elias's knees gave slightly. He turned his eyes away. "No." The mother whimpered again. Not for attention, not even for grief. It was a confession. She had tried. She had fought. She had guarded them in a place no soul should ever die in. And now she had brought him here, because she couldn't do it any more. Elias knelt beside the pups. His hand trembled as he reached out. One lifted its head weakly, the other two barely stirred, and still the mother sat there, watching, as if waiting for his answer. The flashlight beam shook slightly in Elias's hand, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was seeing. The mother dog had collapsed beside her puppies, her chest heaving in sharp, irregular breaths. Her legs tucked beneath her, as if trying to curl around them, to become a shield even now. But her body betrayed her. It trembled violently, every bone straining just to stay upright. Elias crouched beside her slowly, as if movement itself might fracture the moment. His eyes swept the scene, the emaciated pups barely shifting in the dim light, their small chests rising and falling like dying embers. One of them, smaller than the others, was completely still. He didn't touch them. Not yet. He couldn't. Something about the silence in the cabin was sacred. Violating it without reverence felt wrong. Instead he whispered, "You brought me here, so I could see." The mother didn't respond. She simply lay still, her eyes fixed on the motionless pup, and for the first time Elias saw something he hadn't fully grasped until now. She was grieving, not just exhausted, not just wounded. She was mourning, and she'd been doing it alone. Elias's flashlight shifted, the beam falling on the rusted cage in the corner. It was bent inwards from some desperate struggle, the bars twisted and claw-marked. Inside, the dried blood smeared the floor in uneven streaks, some fresh enough to hold color, others long blackened with time. A shallow metal bowl sat overturned, licked clean, crusted with something Elias didn't dare name. This wasn't just neglect. This was abandonment by design. Whoever had left these animals here hadn't intended to come back. His stomach churned. The air was thick with it now, the stench of mildew and mold and despair. Flies buzzed lazily near the cage. The smell of something rotting clung to every surface, and underneath it all, the faint iron scent of dried blood. And then he saw it. In the far corner. Not in the beam of light. Not immediately visible. But once his eyes adjusted, he spotted the fourth shape. Smaller. Curled tightly, like it had tried to stay warm in a place that had long since gone cold. A fourth puppy. And Elias didn't need to go closer to know the truth. It wasn't sleeping. It wasn't breathing. It hadn't for a while. He bit his lip so hard he tasted copper. His knees dropped to the floor with a dull thud. One hand braced on the dirt-caked floorboards, the other clenched into a fist that shook violently at his side. He had seen corpses before, in war, in alleys, in morgues. But nothing prepared him for this. A puppy no older than a few weeks, robbed of a life it never had the chance to live, forgotten in a cabin that reeked of betrayal. Elias turned his head slowly and looked at the mother. She wasn't looking at the dead one. She was watching the living, the three that still breathed, that still might have a chance. And for the first time, Elias understood something deeper. This was her battle, not to survive, not to escape, but to outlive her own hopelessness long enough to save what she could. And today she had made the hardest choice of all. She had gone looking for a stranger she had trusted again. Elias blinked hard against the burning in his eyes. His throat closed around something too wide to swallow. He reached into his bag and tore open the emergency blanket folded inside. Then, gently, like handling smoke, he crawled to the surviving puppies. The largest one stirred as he approached, lifting its head and giving a faint squeak. Elias scooped it into the foil warmth, then the second, whose legs flailed weakly. The third smallest of the group barely reacted, eyes sealed shut, breath shallow and fading. He wrapped them all together, nestling them in the center of the blanket, forming a fragile bundle of life where death had already taken root. And the mother. She made no sound. She only pressed her nose to the tiny head of the smallest pup and exhaled, slow, like letting go of something she'd held too tightly for too long. Elias moved beside her and spoke softly. "We're going now. All of us. You hear me?" Still nothing. So he bent lower and added, quieter still, "You did your part. Let me do mine." And with that, he reached out, not to pet, not to comfort, but to lift. The bundle of puppies rested in his arms like a memory not yet made. He turned to the door, feeling the air shift behind him. Then, a faint sound, the soft tap of nails against wood. The mother dog rose. Her legs were unsteady. Her breath shuddered, but she stood, and she followed him. The cold hit him first, not from the air, but from the weight of the jacket pressed to his chest, soaked through with old blood, damp fur, and something more fragile than either. Breath. 3 tiny bodies. Too still. Too light. Elias clutched them to his chest, swaddled in the thick folds of his canvas coat, their warmth barely perceptible through the fabric. Every few seconds, he pressed the back of his hand gently to the bundle, seeking movement, the rise of a rib cage, the twitch of a paw, any flicker that said, "We're still here." He got nothing from the smallest one, but he didn't stop moving. Outside, the forest greeted him like a stranger with bad news. The sun was collapsing into the horizon, bleeding gold through the treetops. Long shadows stretched across the underbrush, and the temperature had begun its slow, merciless drop. Behind him, the cabin creaked once, then silence. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The mother dog limped after him, one step at a time. Her body screamed exhaustion, but she followed head low, ribs like jagged scaffolding beneath her coat. Every few yards, she staggered. Every time she got back up, she didn't make a sound. Neither did he. There was no room for speech now, no space for grief, only the doing. Elias took the steep incline first, using his shoulder to push aside brush and low-hanging branches. The trail wasn't a trail anymore, just a memory of footsteps carved by animals or forgotten hikers. Roots caught at his boots, thorns scratched at his arms. Still, he pressed forward, heart pounding like a war drum. The puppies didn't cry. That scared him more than anything. At one point his foot caught on a twisted root, and he stumbled, fell to one knee. His arm instinctively cradled the bundle tighter, shielding their heads from the jolt. Dirt filled his mouth. Pain lit up in his ankle. He didn't care. He pushed up from the ground with a guttural sound, somewhere between anger and prayer, and kept moving. Branches reached for his face like fingers. The light was going fast now, and with it so was the margin for survival. He had no map, no signal, only memory and a dog who refused to die behind him. She was still following. God, she was still following. He glanced back, just once, and saw her there, 30 paces behind. Limbs trembling, tongue lolling, her eyes locked on the coat in his arms. And Elias realized she didn't care if she made it, only that they did. His throat tightened. "Not today," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're not going to lose them today." The trees thinned finally. The golden spill of sunset touched the edges of a wider path, the one he'd come from. Civilization was still a mile or more, but at least now he could run. And so he did. Each step was fire in his calves. His breath turned jagged. The puppies felt lighter and heavier all at once, like holding a promise made of smoke. He dared not stop, dared not check. If he looked down and saw death, he wouldn't move again. So he didn't look. He ran. The dirt turned to gravel, gravel to pavement. He passed the sign to Bruma's outskirts without reading it. Past the shuttered bakery, the half-lit lampposts. A few villagers turned their heads, staring as he tore through the plaza like a madman, shirt half open, coat bulging. "Where's the vet?" he gasped, to no one and everyone. But he didn't need an answer. He remembered. Third building, left of the chapel, blue door. He didn't stop running until his shoulder collided with the doorframe and he stumbled inside with a crash. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. "I need help! Please!" The smell of antiseptic hit him. Light overhead, clean floors, a startled voice from behind a curtain, and then hands, gentle, sure, moving fast. But Elias didn't let go. "Careful," he rasped. "Please, they're barely alive." A woman's voice, calm, professional. "Set them down, now." He did. Laid the jacket on the cold steel table, unwrapped it. 3 bodies. One moved, one twitched, one didn't. The vet leaned in immediately, issuing clipped orders to someone out of sight. Fluids, heat pads, oxygen. The room spun around Elias in blurs and static. He turned toward the door just as the dog arrived. She didn't collapse, though every muscle begged her to. She padded in slowly, eyes locked not on Elias, but on the table, on them. The vet stared. "Is this their mother?" Elias nodded, too breathless to speak. "She brought me to them," he managed. I think she's the only reason they're still alive." The vet said nothing, just looked at the dog, and then at Elias. "We're going to try," she said. "But you need to understand, it may be too late." Elias placed a trembling hand on the table's edge. "Try anyway." The mother dog laid down beside the table, her nose pressed against the metal, her eyes never closed. The forest tore at him with every step. Branches clawed his jacket, roots snagged at his boots. Thorns left thin, burning lines across his arms. But Elias didn't slow. Couldn't. The bundle in his arms was too light, too still, and every heartbeat that passed without motion from within felt like a countdown. The puppies were wrapped tight in his coat, 3 fragile shapes pressed against his chest like fading warmth in a cold world. The smallest had stopped twitching. He didn't dare check again. He didn't dare think. Just run. Behind him, Naira limped through the trees, silent and fierce. Her body moved with the stubborn rhythm of something that had survived too much to collapse now. Her breath rasped through the silence, labored but steady. Every time Elias glanced back, she was there. She never left his side. The sun was folding beneath the horizon, bleeding red and amber through the trees. The light bent around them, strange and slanted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And in that light, Naira didn't look like a stray or a ghost. She looked like a mother. They weren't far from the main trail now. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. But time wasn't a unit Elias could feel anymore. It was a drumbeat behind his ribs, each second without movement from the coat. Each moment the tiniest chest failed to rise was a whisper, too late, too late, too late. Elias's legs screamed. He pushed harder. A jagged rock sliced across his shin. He didn't stop. His breath tore from him in sharp gasps. He dodged a branch, stumbled, righted himself again. He could feel the puppies shifting slightly with each jolt. 2 of them stirred weakly. The third, the smallest, remained still. "No," Elias breathed, barely audible. He tightened his grip, held the bundle higher against his chest like it could absorb his own heartbeat. His throat burned, his eyes blurred, not from sweat or wind, but something hotter, more dangerous. He couldn't lose them. Not now. Not after what she'd endured to keep them alive. Not after she found him and begged not with words, but with her whole broken body to follow. "Come on," he whispered. "Just hold on." The forest opened a little, just enough for the sky to bleed in. The trail was close now. He recognized a twisted tree, a hollow stump. Maybe 10 more minutes, maybe less if he didn't fall. A harsh gasp sounded behind him. He turned. Naira had stumbled. Her front paw bent at a painful angle beneath her. Her side struck a low branch. She collapsed to her knees. "Naira!" She didn't whimper, didn't yelp. She just lay there, breathing heavy, tongue lolling, eyes unfocused. Elias hesitated. He wanted to run back. Scoop her up, carry her too. But the weight in his arms shifted, a weak, sudden motion. One of the puppies gave a soft cry. The smallest one hadn't moved. Another second passed. Another. Still nothing. Elias bit down hard on the panic building in his chest, then met Naira's eyes. "Please," he whispered, "don't stop now." And somehow she rose. She pushed one paw forward, then another, unsteady, shaking, but determined. She wasn't running anymore. She was crawling after her children, and that somehow was harder to watch than the blood or the wounds. That was love, scraped raw. Elias turned back toward the trail, legs pumping. He was running downhill now, dangerous, uneven, the ground loose underfoot, but he didn't care. He could see light ahead. Pale blue from a lamp post. The village. Civilization. Help. "Just hold on," he said again. But it came out like a prayer now, a desperate bargain between breath and time. His arms ached, his chest burned, but the puppies were still pressed to him, and one of them, was that a twitch? He wasn't sure. Maybe it was hope playing tricks. Maybe it didn't matter, because he wasn't going to stop. And Naira, gasping, limping, eyes locked on him, was still following. Together, man and dog tore through the last breath of forest as the sun fell away behind them. They ran not just to save what was alive, but to defy what had already been lost. They burst from the tree line like ghosts breaking through the veil. Elias didn't remember how he cleared the final stretch, only that one moment there were trees, and the next cobblestones underfoot, and buildings rising around him like something from a dream. The village, square, quiet, sun-washed, suspended in the amber of early evening, had not been prepared for a man drenched in sweat, face smeared with dirt and blood, carrying what looked like a crumpled coat in his arms, chased by a limping, mud-covered German shepherd. Heads turned. Chairs scraped pavement. A child dropped a toy. But Elias didn't stop. He sprinted past the stunned stares, his lungs on fire, arms curled protectively around the tiny bodies. He couldn't feel his legs, couldn't hear his own breathing over the rush of blood in his ears. Only one thought cut through the noise. Don't let them die here. Not where it's safe. Not now. Someone called after him. An old man by the well, a woman standing with bread in her hands. But he didn't answer, couldn't. There was no time for words. The sign came into view, a small wooden carving above a pale blue door. Clinique Vétérinaire, Dr. Sabine Ravel. He didn't knock. He slammed through the door hard enough that it bounced off the wall. The little bell above jingled once, then went still. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, the scent of antiseptic biting against the forest stench clinging to him. The receptionist stood up in shock, a clipboard falling from her hands. Behind her, a woman in scrubs mid-40s, sharp-eyed, emerged from a back room, latex gloves still on. Elias didn't slow. He fell to his knees, arms trembling, the coat unfurling like petals. 3 puppies, filthy, trembling, barely conscious, one not moving, one barely breathing. He looked up at her, voice cracking. "I need help," he said. "Please." And for the first time, something in him broke. Not loudly, not with drama, just a quiet collapse of the walls he'd held up too long. Tears pooled uninvited. His arms shook harder than they should. His breath stuttered. His whole body leaned forward, almost bowing. The vet blinked once, then moved like lightning. "Marie," she snapped, "warm towels, oxygen, glucose, now." Gloved hands were already beneath the smallest puppy, lifting it with a tenderness that shattered Elias. Naira stepped inside last, dragging her paw, her chest rising and falling like a storm dying out. The receptionist gasped, "Mon Dieu!" Elias turned, still on his knees, and reached toward her. "It's her," he whispered. "She brought me to them." Dr. Ravel glanced at Naira, really looked, and something in her face shifted. Not just concern, recognition. Not of the dog, but of what she'd seen. War, starvation, suffering that has teeth. "Clear the back room," she ordered. "Set up for trauma." "She goes too." Naira, as if understanding the command, lowered herself to the floor near the counter, eyes still trained on the pups being carried away. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She had done her part. The receptionist returned with towels, moving awkwardly, whispering questions Elias couldn't answer. He stood slowly, limbs resisting, his knees buckled. He leaned against the counter, eyes locked on the back door where they'd vanished. Somewhere behind that door, fate was being rewritten or sealed. Someone pressed a water bottle into his hands. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was. Outside the window, the villagers still stared. But no one asked questions, because sometimes the way a man runs, the way a dog limps after him, the way grief and hope can arrive wrapped in silence. There are no words big enough to ask why, only a village that chooses quietly to bear witness. The door clicked shut behind the last villager. Dr. Valeria Ravel didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hands moved like she'd done this 1,000 times, though maybe never under such stakes. Not with something this raw, this trembling, this almost lost. Elias stood at the threshold of the exam room, body covered in dried mud, hands still shaking. His heart beat too loudly for the room. The air was thick with antiseptic and fear. The 3 puppies lay on the stainless steel table, so small. Damp fur clinging to skeletal frames. One whimpered. One lay still. The 3rd struggled to breathe, each inhale a broken engine wheezing against the night. Naira had dragged herself halfway through the door before collapsing at Elias's feet. She didn't try to climb the table. She just watched those eyes. God, those eyes brimming with something no animal should have to carry. Guilt, hope, and grief, all in one glance. Valeria snapped on her headlamp. Glucose, saline, 24 gauge. Now, she barked to her assistant, already sterilizing tiny needles. One hand held the smallest pup's paw. The other slipped the IV in, like threading a needle through time. Come on, little one. A beep. A pause. Another beep, then flat. The monitors screamed. No, not yet, she growled, pressing her palm over the tiny chest. Her thumb moved in rhythmic compressions, impossibly gentle. You do not get to give up. Elias stepped forward, mouth dry. He couldn't breathe. He'd seen death, in the war, in the woods, in memory. But this was different. This was a child, barely born. Valeria pulled out a syringe. Atropine, she muttered. Her assistant passed it, hands trembling. She injected the puppy's heart. 1 beat, then nothing, then a flicker, the smallest rise. Come on, come on, Elias whispered, stepping closer. The heart monitor flickered again, then held steady. Just enough to stay, just enough to try. Valeria didn't smile. She just nodded, forehead glistening, breath catching in her throat. We've got a pulse. The room exhaled, all at once. The 2nd pup stirred under the heating blanket, twitching in reflex, breath shallow but present. The 3rd, limp but warm, didn't cry, but its chest still moved. Valeria turned to Elias, voice lower now. They're not out of danger, but they've got a fighting chance. Elias swallowed hard. His throat burned. He knelt down beside Naira. Her breathing was labored, each exhale a soft whimper. But her eyes hadn't left the table, hadn't stopped watching her children. She brought them all the way here, he said quietly. She never gave up. Valeria looked at the dog, ragged, limping, emaciated, and saw not just an animal, but a mother who had clawed through hell on 3 legs just to deliver what little hope remained. She's why they're alive, Naira whimpered again, a high, thin sound that wasn't pain so much as release. Elias reached forward and cupped her face with both hands. Her fur was matted, her breath smelled of blood and rot, but she leaned into him like he was all she had left to trust. We're not done, he whispered, forehead pressed to hers. Not until they run. Her eyes closed not in surrender, but in something close to belief. Behind them, the monitors beeped steady, the faint sound of breath, the hum of life, fragile, flickering, but real. In that little room behind a village with no questions, something had shifted. Death had been invited in, and for once, it had been made to wait. It was night now, the kind of night where everything held its breath. The clinic had gone still, no more rushed footfalls, no more clattering trays. just the steady metronomic beeping of machines, soft and stubborn, insisting on life. 3 tiny bodies lay wrapped in warm towels on the table above. Monitors blinked faint green. IVs trickled. The heating pads hummed with mechanical devotion, cradling newborn skin too fragile for the world outside. Elias sat on the cold tile floor, back pressed to the wall, legs stretched out, head tilted upward as if staring into the sterile ceiling tiles might give him answers. His jacket, ripped, still damp from the forest, had been folded beneath his spine. He hadn't moved in hours. His hands were stained with dried blood and soil under his nails and in the lines of his palm. But it was the warmth on his lap that held him in place. Naira. She hadn't made a sound. No growl, no whine, no bark. Just laid her head gently across his thigh, as if asking for nothing, just proximity. Permission to let go. Her body still trembled from exhaustion, a soft, involuntary quake that pulsed through her every few breaths. Her fur, once sun-colored, was now a patchwork of ash and filth. But her eyes were closed. For the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't guarding anything. There was no defense left in her, only trust. Elias dared not move. He let his hand rest lightly on her shoulder, felt her ribs lift and fall, shallow, slow, but present. Her heartbeat was faint, but steady. Somehow she had held herself together through something no creature should endure. And now, here, in this moment, she'd finally released it. Into him. A soft noise. He looked up. One of the puppies gave a weak twitch. The smallest one, the one they almost lost, shifted beneath the towel. A whimper. The IV bag swayed faintly above, responding to the tiny struggle below, but the machines didn't panic. Still steady, still alive. He breathed again. The lights in the room had been dimmed, reduced to a low amber glow that made everything feel removed from the world beyond the windows. Like a sacred chamber carved out of grief and held together by the will of a dog who wouldn't die until her children lived. Elias didn't speak. There was nothing to say. His thoughts drifted not backward to what she'd endured, not forward to what came next. Just here, now, in this dim light, in this silence, with a dog whose trust felt heavier than any medal he'd worn. She shifted, just slightly. Her nose pressed into his knee, a sigh escaping her chest like the softest wind through broken branches. His fingers slid through the clumps of her fur, gently untangling bits of leaves and dried blood. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. Outside, the moon had begun to rise. Pale silver spilled through the small window, casting long shadows over the metal table, over the fragile lives breathing beneath blankets, over a man and a dog who had nothing left to prove but everything still to protect. The machines kept beeping. The air remained still, but something had changed in that quiet. It was no longer just waiting. It was believing. It happened quietly. No thunder, no crescendo of sound, just a shift small, miraculous in the stillness. The smallest puppy moved. It was so slight that Elias almost missed it. A twitch beneath the towel, a ripple of breath more sure than the others. Then, slowly, hesitantly, 2 damp, glassy eyes fluttered open, still blue from birth, still unsure of the world they'd entered. Elias froze. The room, the machines, the slow hum of the IV pump, all of it blurred, sound thinning to a silence that rang in his chest. And Naira felt it. She lifted her head from his lap, as if drawn by something she didn't question. Her paws clicked softly on the tile as she rose. With effort, her limbs shaking, She stepped toward the table, one breath at a time. A mother answering the call of something ancient, older than fear, older than pain. She reached the edge and rested her muzzle on the table, her nose barely brushing the corner of the towel. The pup blinked. His eyes, too young to focus, moved gently toward her. Then, instinct guiding her, Nira leaned forward and licked his cheek. Once, twice, tender, ritualistic, like brushing the dust of death off life newly returned, and the puppy responded. He squeaked, a high, broken note of life, fragile but undeniable. His legs shifted, tiny pads twitching against the blanket. The machines held steady. No alarms, just quiet proof that breath had returned to a body everyone thought had already surrendered. Elias's throat tightened. He stepped forward slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly this impossible moment would vanish. But it didn't. It stayed. It unfolded. Nira looked back at him, eyes glistening. No longer the haunted, silent stare of the forest. This was something else. A bridge formed in that gaze, between species, between grief and grace, between life that almost wasn't, and life that had now somehow endured. He sank to his knees beside her. His hand reached for the puppy, then paused halfway, trembling, as if needing permission. Nira nudged his wrist gently with her nose. That was enough. His fingers brushed the tiny body, warm, breathing, real. His voice cracked. Words escaped before he could think to form them. "You made it," he whispered. And then he broke. Not loudly, not with sobs that shook walls, but with the kind of cry that came from a place long sealed, a pressure that had built over years of guilt, buried commands, failed rescues, and locked-up mourning. The sound left him in gasps, raw and silent. His shoulders trembled as he bowed his head beside Nira, forehead touching the table. She didn't move away. She leaned into him. A once feral dog from the woods, once too afraid to let anyone near, now pressing into the broken man beside her like they'd both been shattered the same way, and maybe, just maybe, could be rebuilt together. The room around them disappeared. The clinic walls, the machines, the ticking clock. All that remained was the puppy blinking slowly in the warm towel, a mother who refused to give up, and a man who realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that some things can come back from the edge. It wasn't just survival. It was resurrection. And he had witnessed it, been chosen by it. There, beneath the soft light and sterile smells and quiet hums, something was reborn. Not just the pup, not just Nira, him. Morning bled slowly through the frosted window panes of the clinic, casting pale gold ribbons across the tiled floor. The air was still thick with antiseptic and the sharp quiet of aftershock, the kind that lingers when life has just barely outrun death. Dr. Valeria stood with her arms crossed, her brow furrowed, her lab coat stained in places from a sleepless night. Behind her, the 3 surviving puppies slept curled in a heating box, bellies softly rising and falling. The smallest, the fighter, still bore a crimson ring around his neck where a wire cage had once bit into flesh. "He needs round-the-clock care," she said quietly. "They all do. Tube feeding, temperature checks, injections. It's going to be—" "I know," Elias cut in, voice calm but firm. Her eyes flicked up. "You don't know," she said, not unkindly. "This isn't just about keeping them alive. It's rebuilding what was torn down, day by day, hour by hour. One missed feeding and—" "I'll do it," he said again. Slower this time. not like an answer, but a promise. Valeria studied him for a beat longer. His face was hollow with exhaustion, the kind that no sleep could fix. But in his eyes there was no uncertainty, only something steady, something that had survived war zones and wildfires, and a mother dog dragging him into the woods for one final desperate plea. He didn't waver. Nira sat near the exam table, her ribs still visible beneath the cleaned fur, legs folded awkwardly beneath her. But she watched him, not the way she had in the forest, no longer with suspicion, no longer braced for cruelty. Now, there was something else, something deeper. Hope, not the naive kind, the ragged kind. The kind that crawls through barbed wire and broken glass and still dares to believe there might be someone left who doesn't walk away. Elias walked over and crouched beside her. His knees ached. His hands were raw from bark and snow and carrying more than he thought he could hold. He met her gaze, slow and deliberate, and let the silence stretch. "You brought me here for them," he said, voice low. "But I think maybe it was for you, too." Nira didn't flinch. He reached out, palm open, not demanding, just offered. She looked at it. Then, with trembling muscles, she inched forward. Her nose met his palm, brief, tentative, but real, and in that small gesture something unspoken was sealed. Valeria leaned against the counter and exhaled through her nose, watching them both with something close to awe. "You know, this isn't temporary," she said. "They'll imprint on you. So will she." "I want them to," Elias replied. He stood up slowly, every motion heavy but deliberate. He walked to the heating box and stared at the sleeping pups, their chests fluttering like leaves in the wind. "I've lost enough," he said softly. "I'm not losing them." He looked over his shoulder at Nira again. "She chose me. I don't know why, but I won't make her regret it." He didn't say the rest out loud, but it hung in the air between them. Not like others did, not like he had, once, in another life. Nira lowered her head to the floor, exhaling, not in defeat, but in a kind of surrender that had nothing to do with weakness. The guarded dog from the woods, the one who had once stood between death and what little hope she had left, had now laid her trust at the feet of a man still learning how to forgive himself. And for the first time since the rescue, Elias didn't feel like he was carrying a burden. He felt like he'd been given something sacred, something that had survived the worst of the world and still dared to trust it again. He walked toward the door, and Nira rose behind him, limping, but not hesitant. 3 fragile lives in a box. 1 dog who refused to die, and 1 man who was done running. Outside, the morning snow began to fall again, soft, gentle, cleansing. It was the sound of breath, not his own, that stirred Elias awake. Not sudden, not loud, just steady, warm, close. His eyes opened slowly to the muted blue of dawn filtering through the blinds. The world hadn't returned to full color yet. It remained in shades of quiet gray, as if the sun itself was still deciding whether to rise. The floor beneath him was cold. His back ached. 1 arm was curled awkwardly beneath his coat, now empty of puppies but still damp with worry. Machines hummed low behind him, monitoring fragile rhythms. A faint beeping the tempo of lives that refused to let go. And there, nestled against his legs, was Nira. Her head rested on his thigh as if she'd claimed that space in the night. Not curled up, not alert, just there, breathing, trusting. It took him a second to register the weight of it, not her body, but what it meant. She hadn't left, not once. The mother dog who had fought through hell and thorns, who had dragged herself back to her broken family to plead for help from a stranger, had stayed with him. And in that silence, where no words were spoken and none were needed, something sacred settled between them. Elias let his hand drift down, brushing through the rough fur behind her ears. Naira stirred, but didn't move away. Her eyes fluttered open, one still bloodshot, the other clouded with exhaustion, but they met his. There was no challenge in them now, no fear, just a kind of tired knowing, a mirror. He had seen those eyes before, in soldiers who had come home but never fully returned. In the mirror, on mornings when waking up felt like betrayal because someone else didn't get the chance. And now, in her. We're not so different, he thought. Both carried ghosts. Both had fought to keep something alive, something that might just give their suffering a reason. He shifted slowly, careful not to dislodge her. The blanket from the night before had fallen to the side, half crumpled, half folded over the corner of the steel table where the smallest puppy still lay, breathing barely. They had made it through the night. That alone felt like a miracle. "Morning," came a voice behind him, soft, raspy with sleep. Dr. Valeria stood at the doorway, holding 2 chipped mugs of coffee, dark and steaming. She didn't say more. She just walked over, handed him one, and sat on the opposite bench, her eyes drawn to the heating box. "They're fighters," she said, nodding toward the puppies. "But they'll need weeks." "Maybe more." Elias nodded. "Then we give them weeks." Valeria studied him over the rim of her mug. "You say that like it's easy." He looked down at Naira, still resting against him, then back at the puppies, then back to Valeria. "It's not," he said. "But I've done harder things for less." The vet didn't argue. The room fell quiet again, except for the soft sound of breath and machines and the occasional shift of paws as Naira adjusted in her sleep. Outside, the world had begun to stir. Somewhere in the village, roosters crowed. Footsteps passed in the distance. But inside the clinic, time had held its breath for this moment. Elias closed his eyes briefly and leaned his head back against the wall. He didn't need answers today. He didn't need to know what came next. Not yet. For now, the silence was enough. A silence that wasn't empty. It was shared. And for the first time in a very long while, it didn't feel lonely. The forest had thinned to a hush. After the week of chaos, blood, trembling breaths, and beeping monitors, the quiet that hung over Elias's cabin wasn't peace. Not yet. It was the cautious stillness of a heart learning to beat again. The sun had already crested the trees, dripping through pine branches like molten gold. It touched the steps of the weather-worn porch, softened the nail-heads that jutted from old boards, and glinted faintly off the handle of the door Elias unlocked with a slow, deliberate hand. Behind him, Naira stood still. She didn't look hurt, but he could feel the pause in her bones. The pups, bundled gently inside a heated basket cradled in Elias's left arm, made soft sounds, whimpers and dreams, maybe. He could feel the fragile warmth of their tiny bodies pressing through the fabric, life holding on. But Naira didn't move. Her paws stopped at the edge of the steps, just inches from the threshold. Her ears were forward, her tail low, not tucked, but hovering like a question. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was memory. Something about the frame of the door, the angle of shadow beyond it, the way old hinges creaked, something deep in her maybe from the cabin where the cage sat, where the air had reeked of blood and mold, whispered that going inside meant closing a door that might not open again. And Elias, he saw it. So he didn't coax, didn't call her name, didn't pat his leg, didn't say, "Come on, girl." He just stepped inside, laid the pups down beside the unlit fireplace, and left the door open. He knelt and began tending to them, pulling aside the edges of the warmed towels, checking their noses, gently moving one who had curled too tightly. Each movement said, "This place is safe. This warmth belongs to you." Behind him, her shadow stayed motionless. A single crow called from the woods, then silence, and then pause, slow, one at a time, the soft scrape of nail on wood, a shuffle, a breath held. She stepped in, not all at once, but piece by piece. Her nose first, then her forelegs. She paused at the frame, muscles taut, then crossed the rest of the way, past the door and into the light-struck room. The floor creaked beneath her weight. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She walked past him half a circle and lowered herself beside the pups. Not touching, just near. Close enough that if one of them squeaked or shifted, her ear would catch it. Elias exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He stood and walked to the door, closed it slowly, gently, like sealing off the past with a whisper instead of a bang. Then he turned to her. Her ribs still showed through the thin fur along her sides. Her coat was still patchy, tail matted. But her eyes, those eyes, held something new. Not trust, not yet, but something quieter, something that wasn't fear. Maybe it was permission. He walked back toward the pups and crouched beside them. His fingers brushed over the smallest one, the fighter, the one who'd flatlined and clawed his way back. Then his gaze returned to her. "I can't keep calling you girl," he said softly. She blinked, looked at him. His throat tightened. A name rose uninvited, untested, but true. Naira. It wasn't a word he planned, it was a sound that matched the shape of her presence, weathered, soft-edged, but strong. Naira didn't flinch, she didn't move, but her ear twitched. Her eyes met his again, and stayed. "Naira," he said again, this time a little steadier. "Welcome home." She blinked, then laid her head down beside her pups. One paw stretched across them gently. It was enough. The wind stirred the chimes' outside notes like distant bells, and the fire crackled its first ember as Elias struck the match. And for the first time in a long while, the cabin felt like more than a shelter. It felt like a beginning. The morning lingered, soft as breath on a window pane. Light seeped in slow through the cabin's east-facing windows, kissing the wooden walls in pale amber. Outside, the forest was still asleep, blanketed in mist, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, Elias knelt by the pups again, checking their warmth. 3 hearts still beat. One struggled more than the others, a faint pulse of defiance in a world that hadn't been kind. Behind him, she watched. The mother, the fighter. She lay curled, not guarding them exactly, but not apart either. There was a line drawn somewhere between instinct and caution, and she stood right on it. Her body was a story of every cage she'd survived. Ribs like shadows beneath her fur, old wounds scabbed over, one paw still limping from the injury she never let him examine. But her eyes, Those deep, storm-colored eyes watched Elias not with fear anymore, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. He moved slowly, not just because the puppies needed gentleness, but because she was still learning the world wasn't always claws and chain links. He glanced at her now. The way she tilted her head, not sharply, not flinching, held something new. He smiled, low and soft, and spoke. "I've been thinking," Elias said. "You need a name." She didn't react at first, just blinked once, slow. He shifted, resting one arm across his knee. "You've earned that much, haven't you?" Her ears twitched, but she stayed still. "Naira." The word hung between them, a syllable both soft and unyielding. It wasn't a name he'd read or heard or planned. It had come to him in the silence of the night like she had, unexpected, undeniable. It means light reborn. Her head tilted ever so slightly. Elias gave a breath of a laugh. "I figured it fit." She didn't move right away. But then, her tail, just a twitch, not a wag, not joy, but a whisper of acknowledgement, the smallest thread of something letting go. He caught it. That flick of tail held more weight than any bark or growl could. It said, "I heard you." He lowered his voice even more. "Naira," he repeated, "that's who you are now. Not a number, not a file, not a cage." She blinked again. And this time, when she laid her head down beside the pups, her eyes didn't leave his. He stayed kneeling a few feet away. Let her see him. No threat, no command, just presence. She had lost everything. And yet, here she was, not running, not retreating, just watching, just staying. "You're safe here," he said, and meant it more than anything he'd said in months. "With me." A minute passed, maybe more, and then, so subtly, it could have been missed. She exhaled. A long, quiet breath that deflated her shoulders, softened her jaw. For the first time, Elias saw it. She was tired of surviving. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to live. He looked down at the smallest pup, nestled close to her chest, and then back up. "Naira," he said again, a vow wrapped in a name. "We start over. All of us." The wind outside shook the pine branches, sending a cascade of needles to the ground. But inside the stillness shifted. Something old had broken, and something new had just begun. The days came quiet. No fanfare, no grand revelations, just the rhythm of life slowly returning to what had nearly been lost. Elias rose early. He always had. But now there were more lives waiting on the other side of his breath. 3 tiny ones who didn't yet know how cruel the world could be, who only knew the warmth of each other and the constant unblinking gaze of their mother and him. He washed his hands, tied back his sleeves, and whispered, "Morning, little ones," like the words were an offering. The cabin smelled of pine soap and damp towels. He'd cleared a corner of the room, laid down fleece and old flannel shirts, built a nest out of what softness he could find. The wood stove burned slow and steady, casting a glow that never reached too far, but never faded either. Each morning he bathed the pups with careful fingers, one at a time, the water warm, his touch gentler than even he thought possible. They were so small still, bellies rising and falling like leaves in a breeze, eyes barely open, legs wobbly, mouths searching for something only Naira could give. She watched him the whole time, always watching, Not from fear anymore, not exactly, but from that place where a heart has been broken too many times to offer itself freely. Her body never strayed more than 2 feet from the pups. When Elias moved, so did she. When he fed them with a bottle and whispered their names, little nicknames he hadn't told anyone, she hovered like a silent guardian, neither growling nor relaxing. Just there, present, relentless in her watch. Sometimes their eyes met, sometimes not. But when they did, something passed between them. Not words, not even understanding, just recognition. You're trying. So am I. The pups grew stronger day by day. The smallest, the one who'd flatlined, was the loudest now, his voice a rasp of defiance in the mornings. He'd latch onto the bottle with such determination, Elias sometimes laughed out loud, surprising even himself. It had been so long since anything made him laugh. But the nights, that's when the ghosts came. Naira didn't sleep. When the fire dimmed and Elias lay curled on the cot just feet from the pups, she sat by the window. Every night, unmoving, her breath fogged the glass. Outside, the woods breathed in shadows. Branches scraped the roof. A fox screamed once sharp and fleeting, and she flinched so hard she nearly knocked over the water bowl. Elias stirred but didn't speak. He'd learned not to. Some things weren't ready for comfort. Some wounds needed silence to begin their healing. But he watched her from the cot, chest rising and falling beneath a wool blanket, and he understood something wordless. She was trying to protect a future that still looked too much like her past. Every creak of the porch, every gust of wind through the pines, she tensed. A low whine sometimes escaped her throat before she could suppress it, her body trembling not from cold, but memory. And yet, she stayed. She didn't run, didn't snap, didn't vanish back into the woods like some part of her wanted to. Elias watched her for hours some nights, the way her tail curled tight around her legs, the way she blinked slowly at the dark, as if waiting for something that had never come back. Maybe she was waiting for someone, or maybe she was just learning that this time no one would come to take what was hers. At dawn, when the sky turned silver and the frost began to melt from the window glass, she would finally lower her head, not on the cot, not beside Elias, but close enough now that her breath stirred the hem of his blanket. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something like surrender, something like hope, just beginning to sprout in the cracks of a soul that hadn't dared hope in years. And Elias, sleepless, silent, present, watched the frost melt on the window and whispered to the ceiling, "We're getting there, girl." Outside, the forest exhaled. Inside, so did she. It was a quiet morning, the kind that held its breath. Mist clung to the treetops like a veil not yet lifted. The sun was slow to rise, casting long fingers of light through the gaps in the pines. Birds whispered instead of singing, as if not to wake the ghosts still asleep in the corners of the world. Elias stood at the edge of the back door, hand resting on the latch of the old gate. It creaked slightly under his touch. Weather-worn, familiar. Behind him, Naira stood rigid. He didn't turn, didn't speak, just opened the gate. Beyond it lay a stretch of grass, wild and uneven, bordered by fir trees and tangled ivy. A garden, once, a sanctuary maybe. Now it was just space, untouched, unscripted. Freedom. Naira didn't move. Her paws were planted on the wooden threshold like they'd grown roots there. The pups, still too young to wander, were safe inside, but her body remained between them and whatever waited outside the open gate. Her ears twitched, tail stiff, eyes locked forward. Every muscle in her was coiled tight, like a spring waiting to snap. Elias stepped aside, never looking back. "You don't have to," he said, voice calm, low, like a stone smoothed by river water. "But if you want to." He let the rest drift into the wind and waited. Minutes passed. Then her right paw lifted barely. It hovered mid-air, trembling before settling back down. A false start. She glanced back once, at the pups, at him, then forward again. One breath, two. The second paw moved, then the first, then both. She took a step, then another. The wooden threshold disappeared beneath her, replaced by the damp earth. The moment her paw touched grass, she froze again. The air smelled different out here. It wasn't the sterile scent of clinics or the thick musk of shelters. It was raw, cold, clean. It carried memory in it. Distant thunder, a shouted command, the click of a chain-link door. She scanned the yard like a soldier who'd learned too many times that peace was only the pause between sirens. Her gaze flicked to every moving branch, every rustle in the underbrush. But nothing came, no cages, no hands to drag her back, just dew on the grass and the slow warming of the day. And Elias leaning quietly against the wall, not watching her like a project, but like a witness. A few more steps, and she stood in the center of the yard, surrounded by space, vulnerable, exposed. She shivered, but didn't run. A robin flitted down from a pine branch, landed near her front paw. She tensed, but didn't lunge, just watched, and for a second, something soft flickered in her eyes. The robin hopped once, then flew off in a streak of red. Naira tilted her head slightly. Then she looked up, not at Elias, not at the trees, up to the sky. Her ears slowly fell back against her head, not in fear, but in something like awe. The blue above was endless, a canvas with no ceiling. It wrapped around her, unjudging, untamed. It didn't ask anything of her, didn't restrain. It simply was. And for the first time since he'd met her, Elias saw something in her body shift, a loosening, as if the weight she'd carried for too long no longer crushed her completely. She sat, just barely, legs still taut, but not trembling. The wind brushed her fur. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't step forward, didn't say a word. This moment wasn't his to interrupt, but in the stillness, in the silent communion between a broken creature and the world that had hurt her, he saw something sacred. This wasn't just a dog stepping into a garden. It was a survivor testing the edge of a cage that no longer held her. It was a soul asking the sky if maybe, just maybe, it was allowed to feel again, and the sky, in its quiet way, answered, yes. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when the world holds its breath, and even the forest seems afraid to move. The cabin stood in near darkness, save for the low amber glow of the fireplace, flickering like a heartbeat in a quiet chest. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, whispering through the cracks like old memories trying to find their way back in. Inside, Elias was half asleep in the worn armchair, a book forgotten in his lap, his eyes closed but his senses half awake, as they always had been since the war. Then it came. A sharp, broken bark. Then another, desperate, choked. He was on his feet before the third. It wasn't the bark of alert. It was a cry. The kind pulled from the belly, older than thought, raw as an open wound. He found her curled in the corner between the old dresser and the wall, where shadow swallowed most of her form. Her chest heaved. Her claws scraped against the wooden floor, as if trying to outrun something only she could see. Her eyes were wide, but not awake. She wasn't here. She was somewhere else. Somewhere far. Somewhere dark. And whoever she was running from, she couldn't outrun them. "Naira." Elias knelt slowly, his voice a hush. She didn't respond. A whimper broke from her throat, high and guttural. Her body trembled like wire pulled too tight. Her ears flattened against her skull, and her limbs pushed against nothing, as if caught in a fight she'd already lost 100 times. Elias didn't call louder. He didn't reach for her too fast. He just moved beside her and placed a hand steady, warm, open on her back. At first, she flinched, then froze, like even the weight of that gentle touch carried danger. But he didn't move it. He didn't try to wake her, didn't speak, didn't pry into her fear with questions it had taken years to bury. He just stayed. The silence stretched. Then her breathing slowed bit by bit, like a storm cloud exhaling. Her paws stopped twitching. The tension began to bleed out of her muscles, one ripple at a time. Her body, still pressed into the floor, eased from rigid to exhausted. Her tail, once coiled so tightly against her body it might as well have been trying to disappear, now lay slack. Her eyes fluttered open. Glass still clung to them, but they saw him now. And in them, beneath the fog, was something unspeakably human. Recognition, regret, relief. She didn't move, didn't lift her head, but she let out a long, tired breath, the kind you only breathe when you've survived something again. Elias didn't say, "You're safe now," because he knew those words didn't always land. Safety for some wasn't a place. It was a question they'd never learned how to ask. So instead, he said nothing. He just sat, back against the same wall, his hand still on her shoulder. And together, in that narrow pocket of the world, they waited for the ghosts to fade. She didn't fall back to sleep, not right away. But she closed her eyes and didn't bark again. Outside, the wind died down. Inside, the fire let out a soft pop like the cabin exhaled too. And in the hush that followed, something shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. Because sometimes, healing isn't a breakthrough. It's the first night you realize no one's coming to hurt you anymore. It was the kind of morning the world forgot to ruin. The fog had lifted, and with it, something in Elias's chest. The sun stretched over the pine ridge like a promise not yet broken, and in the backyard, life was unfolding loud, messy, and miraculous. 3 puppies tumbled through the overgrown grass like they'd been born to chase the wind. Tiny legs outpaced their coordination. Tails wagged without rhythm. One latched onto his bootlace like it was prey, refusing to let go as Elias limped across the yard, chuckling under his breath. All right, let me walk, you little menace." The pup growled, if you could call it that. More squeak than threat. Another leapt clumsily after a butterfly and face-planted into a patch of daisies. Elias laughed out loud, an honest sound, one that startled even him. When was the last time he'd done that? Not the polite kind, not the wounded exhale, but laughter. He lowered himself to the worn bench under the crooked maple tree and watched the ears flopping, paws skidding, the world still so new it hadn't grown teeth yet. They didn't know what cages were. They didn't know what betrayal smelled like. They didn't brace when the wind changed, not like their mother. Naira stood near the fence line, silent, her posture alert but not stiff, eyes scanning the horizon with the memory of someone who once waited for danger like it was a friend running late. But she didn't hover over the pups anymore. She let them wander, let them trip, let them fail. And when they yelped from a misstep or barked at shadows, she didn't panic. She watched. And that in itself was trust. Elias followed her gaze. Nothing moved out there but leaves. She turned to him just briefly, and something passed between them. Not eye contact exactly, but presence. She knew he was watching her pups. She let him, and that was everything. One of the puppies climbed up his shin like a miniature explorer scaling Everest and licked his knuckles. Its tiny tongue was warm, wet, real. Elias froze. A year ago, that same touch might have shattered him. There had been days, weeks, when the only sensation he could feel was cold metal in his hand and the buzz of a radio in his ear, where joy felt dangerous, where a smile was something borrowed from someone else's life. But now there were paw prints on his pant leg and slobber on his wrist. And for the first time in what felt like 1,000 heartbeats, he didn't want to wash it off. A breeze rolled through the yard, lifting petals and memories alike. One of the puppies flopped against his side and let out a sigh that sounded too old for its size. Another curled into a patch of clover. The third was still chasing butterflies, determined to outrun the sun. Elias leaned back and let his eyes close for just a second. Not from exhaustion, but peace. A rare, trembling peace. Because somewhere in the noise of play and the rhythm of tiny feet, he felt it. Happiness. Not the kind that roared, not the kind you announced to the world, but the quiet kind. The kind you don't realize you're living until you notice your hands aren't shaking anymore, until the world no longer feels like something waiting to be survived, until you see a dog once broken stand guard over her children, not with fear, but with pride. The camera had been collecting dust longer than grief had collected in his chest. Elias found it buried in a drawer that still smelled faintly of pine and old smoke. He didn't reach for it with purpose, more like instinct, like some part of him was finally brave enough to see again, to witness, not just survive. It had been his sister's. The strap still bore the fray marks of her denim jacket where it used to hang, bouncing against her hip as they hiked through Granite Hollow, chasing sunsets and silences worth keeping. He remembered the last time it clicked. Winter, before the accident, before the silence swallowed her name from the air. He hadn't taken a single shot since. Not until now, not until them. Out in the backyard, the late sun pooled across the grass like honey. The pups were playing again, soft paws pressing into dirt, noses covered in pollen, one chewing triumphantly on a stick 3 times its size. Elias lifted the camera. The shutter made a soft chuck, and with it, a tiny piece of his heart came back online. He moved slowly, carefully, almost reverently, not posing them, not commanding, just witnessing, letting the world unfold as it would. A pup yawning in a bed of wildflowers, 2 tumbling into a shallow mud patch, their fur smeared with innocence. Naira sitting near the fence, her body still, regal, guarded. But her ears were relaxed, her tail didn't tuck. Her eyes, though, her eyes met his lens, and she didn't look away. He knelt, held his breath, and pressed the shutter. Click. That was the shot, the one he knew he'd print. Her silhouette framed against the bleeding gold of the late daylight, eyes soft not because she trusted the world, but because she was learning to forgive it. There was something sacred in that look, something ancient, something human. Back inside the cabin, Elias cleared the old photos off the wall, the faded landscapes, the distant mountaintops. They no longer held him like they used to. They were places he had run to, not through. Now he printed the new ones, slowly, methodically. One by one the wall changed, from escape to return. A pup tangled in a blanket, Naira sleeping beside her babies, one paw still twitching in dreams. Elias holding a tiny bundle of fur against his chest. He hadn't meant to be in that one. Naira had nudged his elbow mid-shot, and the shutter had caught him smiling, eyes closed, unaware. He almost didn't keep that photo, but he did. Because it was real. At the center of the wall, under a wooden beam where a crack ran like a lightning scar, he pinned the photo of Naira head, slightly tilted, eyes cast toward the light. It didn't look like a portrait. It looked like a reckoning, or a release, or maybe both. He sat beneath it that night, the fire crackling low, pups curled at his feet, Naira just a breath away from sleep. He looked up at the photo and whispered into the quiet, "You made it." Not just her. All of them. Even him. It started with a sound. Faint but wrong. Not wind, not wildlife. Not the soft rustle of pups tumbling over each other in the grass. Tires. On gravel. Elias paused mid-step at the porch, hammer still in hand. He squinted down the long, winding road that cut through the edge of Granite Hollow, where trees whispered secrets too old for names. A black car emerged from the tree line, sleek, silent, and out of place. Government black. No dust on the windshield, no plates on the front. Just a polished void, devouring sunlight. Elias didn't move. Neither did Naira. She was by the garden, ears twitching, then flattening. The pups scattered toward the cabin with an instinct older than memory. But Naira didn't follow. She froze. Her body stiffened, every muscle coiled like wire pulled too tight. And then a low, guttural growl broke the silence. It wasn't rage. It was memory, buried deep, ripped open like an old wound. Elias turned to her slowly. Her stance wasn't just defensive, it was primordial. Tail rigid, eyes locked not on the car but on something beyond it. Two figures stepped out. Men in gray coats. Sunglasses despite the shade. Clean boots that hadn't touched real mud in years. They didn't look around. They didn't hesitate. They walked forward like they knew exactly where they were going, like this was unfinished business. Elias didn't need her to speak. He saw it in her eyes. This wasn't just fear. This was recognition. Naira bared her teeth, a warning, a memory, a vow. Elias stepped down from the porch, instinctively placing himself between her and the men, his voice low, controlled. Not one more step. The taller man paused, adjusted his cuff. "We're just here to talk," he said. Smooth, practiced. But Naira lunged forward a step, snarling now, body quaking, with something raw and ancient. Elias held out a hand, not to stop her, but to anchor her, to remind her this wasn't then. She wasn't alone anymore. "She's not going anywhere," Elias said coldly. The shorter man's gaze flicked to Naira, then to the pups peeking from the cabin door. "So," he said, "you kept them." Elias didn't answer, because in that moment he wasn't just a man who'd found a broken dog. He was her shield, and she was no longer afraid, only ready. They didn't ask nicely. They knocked like men who'd never heard the word no in their lives, sharp, hollow, like a command disguised as a courtesy. Elias opened the cabin door slowly, the weight of it dragging like the hush before a storm. The two men stood stiff on his porch, one with a clipboard, the other with a stare that didn't blink. "We're here for the dog." No name, no greeting, just declaration. Elias didn't flinch. "She's not yours." The taller one stepped forward. "Her name is Kira, Unit 7, Federal Property. She's part of a discontinued defense program. Our records show she went AWOL 6 months ago after a breach at Site Echo." His voice was calm, but beneath it was a tremor of control, of possession. Elias said nothing, just felt the shift beside his leg. "Nira." She stepped forward, not behind him, beside him. No leash, no command, just presence. The shorter man narrowed his eyes. "You've been sheltering her, and the offspring. That's a felony, sir." Elias looked down at her, then back at the men. "No, I've been protecting her from whatever you turned her into." A long silence. Then the man with the clipboard smiled like a blade unsheathing. "You don't understand what she is. That dog's been through a protocol your kind can't begin to—" "She's not a thing," Elias snapped. His voice cut the air clean. "She's not your asset, not your weapon, not your project. She's not Kira. Her name is Nira, and she stays." Nira's ears tilted slightly at the name, but her gaze never left the men. The taller one shifted his stance, resting a boot just past the edge of Elias's porch. It was subtle, but Elias saw it. A line crossed. His hand slid slowly behind the doorframe, not for a weapon, just for a grip on something real. A reminder that this was his home, that she had found her way here, not by chance, but by surviving hell, and no one was dragging her back. The man gave a hollow smile. "You're making a mistake." Elias's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe." He stepped forward, just enough for his boot to press a line into the dirt. "But it's my mistake to make." And Nira? She didn't growl, she didn't run. She stood still and silent like a ghost refusing to vanish. It was the silence that came first, a silence so thick even the forest seemed to hold its breath. The men shifted, eyes flicking toward the edge of the porch, expecting fear, compliance, maybe even retreat. What they got was something else. Nira stepped forward, one pace, then another. Her chest rose. Her body, lean from motherhood and hunger, now stood like steel reforged. The last of the old tremble was gone. All that remained was decision. And then she barked, not a whimper, not a warning, a command. Deep, sharp, primal. It tore through the morning like thunder cracking the sky. The taller man flinched, hand flying to his sidearm before realizing how ridiculous it looked, armed against a mother defending her children. The shorter one cursed under his breath, taking a half-step back. "Jesus!" The bark came again, louder this time, more than sound. It was memory breaking its chains. It was her voice, the voice they'd trained to obey, to suppress, to submit. But it wasn't theirs anymore. Elias didn't move, just watched. Watched the way she held her ground, body low, tail steady, eyes locked. Not afraid. Never again. The taller man turned to the other. Forget it. What? He shook his head. She's gone. We can't use her now. There was something bitter in his tone, not just defeat, but the sting of irrelevance. He looked at Elias, one last time. You don't know what you've got. Elias gave a faint smile. Yeah, I do. Naira didn't bark again. She didn't have to. They were already backing away. One of them spat on the dirt, as if trying to reclaim territory with saliva. The tires kicked gravel as they turned, and just like that, they were gone. Elias exhaled, slow, deep, and when he looked down, Naira was still there, at his side, still watching, still guarding, but this time, herself. The black car shrank into the distance, swallowed by trees and dust. Naira didn't chase it, didn't bark, didn't run. She just stood, silent on the porch, muscles tight, eyes fixed. Not in panic, not in readiness, just watching. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed, saying nothing. He understood now. This wasn't about them anymore. Not the men, not the program. It was about her. The ghosts she couldn't name, the cages she couldn't forget. The orders barked in cold rooms by cold men who never asked if she was afraid, only if she was useful. And then the car was gone. The sound of tires faded. A breeze rustled through the grass. The wind touched her fur like something unfamiliar. She didn't flinch. Instead, slowly, Naira sat. Her ears lowered. And then a sigh. Not just a breath. It came from deep in her chest, like something ancient being exhaled for the first time. Elias heard it. He crouched beside her, his hand brushing lightly along her back. She didn't pull away, didn't stiffen. He looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. It's over now. She didn't turn to him, but her body leaned just enough to feel his warmth, to choose it, and in that small surrender was a quiet victory. No medals, no headlines, just a mother, no longer hunted, just a man, no longer alone, and the morning light beginning to stretch across the porch, soft, golden, healing. The morning after the men left, the cabin was still. A silence not born of fear, but of exhaustion, of memory beginning to settle. Naira slept near the fireplace, one paw resting protectively over two of her pups. Her breathing was slow, measured, but Elias noticed the tremble in her ear each time the wind touched the door. He didn't want to disturb her, but something had caught his eye. Her collar. What remained of it was torn, the edges frayed, leather eaten by time and tension, and tucked under the buckle, half hidden by fur and dirt, was something metallic. Elias crouched, gently parting the fur. It was a tag. Small, oval, steel worn smooth at the edges. He rubbed it between his fingers, smearing away a layer of grime. The engraving was faint, but still there. K9049, Unit Guardia Civil. He blinked. Guardia Civil. That wasn't local law enforcement. That was overseas European, elite, hardline, often off the books. His heart thudded once, heavy. He rose, fetched his laptop from the shelf. Dust flew from the case as he opened it. He hadn't touched it in months. It took him a while to dig through language barriers, government encryption, and silence. But eventually, fragments began to surface. A list, unit dogs, classified assignments, K9049, deployed in multiple black operations. Not just crowd control, not just narcotics. Nira, if that had even been her name, had worked explosives, surveillance, infiltration. One entry. Injury sustained during failed perimeter breach. Handler deceased. Dog presumed lost. No recovery attempted. No recovery attempted. The words hit harder than he expected. Elias leaned back in his chair, hands folded against his lips. His breath caught. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been retired. She'd been left, bleeding, confused, disposable. He looked over at her now. The scar behind her ear, the tiny limp in her right hind leg, the instinct to shield her pups from every shadow. It wasn't just trauma. It was abandonment. No accountability, no inquiry, just silence. And yet here she was, alive, protecting, mothering, learning to trust again. His fingers curled around the badge again. It was cold in his hand. He stared at it for a long time, then stood. He crossed the room quietly, knelt beside her. She stirred, eyes opening halfway, one ear flicking toward him. Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just reached into the fireplace bin, pulled out an old tin box, the one he used to keep his sister's photos. Gently he opened it, removed everything inside. Then, with reverence, he placed the steel tag in the center, snapped the lid shut, not erased, but retired. He placed the box on the highest shelf. Out of reach, but never out of mind. Then he turned back to Nira. "You don't wear their name anymore," he said softly. "Not in this house." She blinked. And for the first time since he'd found her, Nira wagged her tail. Once. Small, but enough. Elias hadn't written anything in years. Not since the last post on his sister's blog, the one he never took down, though it collected dust like her old camera on the shelf. But that morning, something stirred. A restlessness in his hands, a truth that finally had shape. He sat at the kitchen table. Nira lay at his feet, one paw draped over her smallest pup, and he began to type. Her name is Nira. At least that's the name she answered to when the world forgot hers. The words came slow at first, hesitant, but then they came all at once. He wrote about the badge, the scar, the night she growled for the first time, not from fear but from strength. He wrote about the pups curled beneath her belly, about how her eyes searched for exits even in silence, about the moment she stepped onto grass and didn't bolt, about how she stood beside him when they came for her, about how she had stayed. He hit publish, closed the laptop, thought nothing of it. But by morning the inbox was full. Hundreds of names, some short, some sprawling. Subjects like, "She looks like mine before they took her. We thought we were alone. Thank you for naming the ache." By nightfall, it wasn't hundreds anymore. It was thousands. Veterans, rescuers, retired handlers, people who had watched loyalty go unrewarded, survivors who had spoken to no one but their dogs. Photos poured in scars and fur and medals that had never been pinned. Someone designed a graphic, Nira looking into the light. Someone else printed shirts. "Second chances run on 4 legs." Then came the donations, small amounts mostly, 15 here, 25 there. A letter from a boy who sent his birthday money for dogs like the one who found my sister. Elias didn't even realize he'd been building it until he saw the receipts in a folder titled Hope. By the end of the week, he had a blueprint sketched out on the kitchen wall. Not just kennels, a sanctuary. one with wide-open fields and indoor beds, with heat lamps, vet staff, a therapy room, a space where dogs discarded by systems could learn that love didn't come with conditions. He pinned the first sketch under a photo. Nara curled around her pups. She watched him from the rug, tilting her head. "You're going to be on the sign," he said softly. She didn't respond. But later, when the light shifted and dusk began to settle, she climbed onto the couch for the first time, pressed her side gently into his, and stayed. The letter came in a plain envelope. No return address, just a smudged postmark from 3 states away. Elias almost didn't open it. He thought it might be another donation receipt or a story from someone whose path mirrored Nara's. But the handwriting stopped him. It was blocky, pressed hard into the paper like the writer didn't trust their own hands not to shake. He sat down on the edge of the porch as the pups tumbled in the yard. Nara watched them closely, ears twitching at every chirp of a bird or gust of wind. She'd relaxed, yes, but she never forgot to listen. Elias unfolded the letter. "I think the dog in your photo saved my life." Her name wasn't Naira back then. We called her Ghost, because she always moved first. Saw first, we were pinned down, ambush training gone real. I was bleeding out. The others were too far. But she stayed, laid beside me and barked until someone came. I remember her eyes. They said she didn't make it, that she was retired after injury. That's how it always ends, isn't it? But then I saw your post. I know it's her. She's older now and softer, maybe. But those eyes? You don't forget eyes like that. Tell her thank you for staying, for being the last thing I saw before they pulled me out. S. Marquez, Sergeant Rhett. Elias didn't realize he was crying until one of the teardrops landed right on the name. His hands shook as he folded the letter again, slower this time. More like ceremony. He walked down the steps, past the garden where the grass had started to grow thick and wild, past the old tire swing he'd tied back up, though no one had used it in years. Naira met him halfway. She didn't bark, didn't tilt her head, just waited. He crouched to her level, holding out the letter like an offering. He said, "You saved him, years ago." She blinked. He smiled, wet-eyed. "You never stop saving people, huh?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, like he was afraid saying it too loud would break the fragile quiet between them. The fire crackled softly behind them, casting golden flickers across the floor. Outside, the wind had stilled. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath, and for a long, still moment, neither of them moved. Naira stood just a few feet away, watching him the way only she could. Her ears were half tilted, eyes steady and deep. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. There was something eternal in her silence, something that said, "I heard you. I remember it too." Then, as if pulled by something older than time, she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, no fear in her limbs anymore. She gently placed her head beneath his open hand. No tricks, no commands, no hesitation, just trust. His fingers curled slowly into her fur, coarse and thick from months of healing. She was stronger now, solid, her breathing steady and calm. But under his palm he could feel the faintest tremor. Not from fear, but release. The weight of it said everything. Everything she couldn't say, everything she'd carried, everything she had finally let go. Elias closed his eyes. The letter from the retired officer still rested on the table behind them, its words still echoing in his chest. "She saved me once. I thought she died, but she hadn't." She had survived. And she had waited, maybe not for him, but for someone to see her as more than a weapon, more than a memory. She never gave up, Elias murmured, not sure if he was saying it for her or for himself. Even when the world did. Naira didn't move, but he felt her lean into him, just a little heavier, just enough to say, "I know." His throat tightened. For all the battles he had faced, for all the ghosts he had buried, this moment undid him in the softest way. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't revenge. It was grace. And grace, he realized, never needed to be loud. They stayed like that man and dog, soldier and survivor, scar and healing wound, until the fire burned low and the stars blinked in through the window. And in that stillness, Elias understood something simple and profound. Naira hadn't come back to the world. She had brought him back to it, not with words, not with noise, but with the quiet act of staying right here, right now. Home. The wind moved like breath across the tall grass, rippling waves of gold under a pale spring sun. Out in the open field behind the sanctuary's new fence, 4 German shepherd pups galloped with the reckless joy only the unburdened could know. Their legs, once wobbly and unsure, now carried them like wind-borne arrows, ears flopping, tongues out, hearts loud in their chests. No walls, no cages, only sky. And leading them Naira. Her coat caught the light like polished amber. The faint scars along her flank were still there if you looked closely, but time had turned them into something else, not wounds, not even history, symbols of survival, of reclamation. Elias stood by the fence with a camera slung around his neck and a look on his face he hadn't worn in years. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. Not the kind that makes noise. The kind that anchors. He adjusted the lens and focused. Click. One of the pups pounced on a butterfly and missed. Click. Another skidded in the grass and yipped in triumph. Click. Then Naira stopped. She turned her head slightly toward Elias, not directly, just enough that the light caught her profile, the same profile he had photographed once, months ago, when she first looked into the sun without fear. But this time she looked not toward the light, but from it, carrying it with her. Click. Elias lowered the camera and exhaled slowly, chest rising and falling like the hills beyond. They weren't surviving anymore. They were living. And sometimes he thought that was the greater miracle. He stepped out into the field, boots brushing wild flowers, and knelt in the middle of it all. The pups came bounding toward him like a tide, Naira a steady current behind them. She stopped just before reaching him, standing tall as if guarding this moment. He opened his arms, and they all collapsed into him. Fur, laughter, breath. A heartbeat that no longer ran from the past, but toward the promise of what still could be. The storm came without warning, not with rage, but reverence. One moment, the afternoon air hummed with warmth. The next, the sky pulled open like a wound, spilling soft gray light and a hush that silenced even the birds. Thunder didn't roar. It breathed. The first raindrops fell like whispers across the sanctuary yard. The puppies, startled, scrambled toward the porch in a whirl of fur and squeals, their paws pattering against the wooden steps as they vanished indoors. But Naira didn't move. She stood in the middle of the open field, still as a sentinel, her head tilted toward the clouds. Elias stepped out after her, rain dotting his shoulders, camera still in hand. "Naira," he called gently. She didn't look back. Instead, she closed her eyes. The rain kissed her face, slid down the ridge of her spine, soaked into the thick fur that once clung to her in fear. Her ears twitched at the thunder's distant rumble, then stilled. No crouching, no trembling, no flight. Elias watched from beneath the eaves, heart caught in the quiet ache of it. Because this wasn't resistance, it wasn't defiance, it was surrender. To peace, to trust, to now. He stepped down from the porch, barefoot in the grass now soaked and sweet, walked slowly until he stood beside her. She didn't move away. For a long moment they just stood there, man and dog, under the open sky. The rain blurred everything but the truth. She was free. And maybe, finally, so was he. The fire crackled softly, low and steady, casting warm light against the wooden walls of the cabin. Rain still tapped on the windows, but gentler now, as if the storm itself had curled up outside to rest. Inside, all was still. Elias sat cross-legged on the floor, a wool blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. His hands smelled faintly of cedar and damp fur. The scent of smoke clung to his sleeves. Across from him, Naira stretched out near the hearth, the pups curled beside her like fallen leaves, tired, safe, whole. She stirred, lifted her head, and crossed the room in silence. No command, no hesitation. She lowered her weight into the crook of his lap with a quiet sigh, her breath warm against his skin. The scar on her ear caught the firelight. No longer a mark of violence, but of survival. Elias leaned down and pressed his forehead gently to hers. "We're home," he whispered. "Not a place, not a shelter, a truth." Naira's eyes fluttered closed, her body slack with trust. No collar, no leash, no chains of memory dragging her into the dark. Just this, the flicker of firelight, the sound of steady rain, and the heartbeat beneath her ear. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and something else, something unspoken. A beginning. In the quiet bond between Elias and Naira, we find something timeless, the healing power of love, the resilience of the broken, and the silent language shared between a man and a dog who had both forgotten how to trust. Naira wasn't just a survivor, she was a reminder that no soul is ever too lost to be found again. This story isn't just about a German shepherd. It's about every animal who's ever waited at a shelter gate, every scarred paw that still dares to walk forward, and every human heart cracked open by the presence of something pure. Naira's journey reminds us that animals don't just need saving, they save us too. To love a dog like Naira is to believe in second chances, in starting over, in forgiveness that asks for nothing but presence. And in a world that often moves too fast, it's stories like these that bring us back to what matters: kindness, connection, and the quiet courage to begin again. May we all be more like Elias. May we all meet a Naira. And may we never forget that sometimes home is not a place. It's a heartbeat beside your own.